Okay, here we go. Hopefully you can all hear me. So I'm a little different than some of the other panelists because I also have an MD. As was mentioned in the introduction, I'm a neurosurgeon and also a scientist, so I'm a MD PhD. I'm not going to talk too much about the medical part. It is, just kind of how it led to where I am now. But just as a side note, supposedly there's only 33 African-American female neurosurgeons in the country. And I'm pretty sure I'm the only one that has a basic science lab. So let's see. All right, so I did sort of the traditional path. I grew up really liking science. My dad had a PhD, so I grew up being in the lab on the weekends and thinking science was super cool. So when I went into undergraduate, I was pretty sure that I was going to do science. And I think somewhere along the way, as I found that I was really liking neuroscience and just, doing research experiences in the summer and, maybe talking to some disgruntled postdocs, like I'm not sure, but somewhere along the way, I kind of decided that if I was going to do research, I needed to do research that was clinically relevant. And a good way for me to do that would be to get an MD PhD. So I ended up applying to and getting into MD PhD programs, and I ended up going to the program at Boston University. It was a traditional MD PhD program, which means you do the first 2 years of medical school, and then you do a full PhD in whatever lab and whatever department you choose. And it can take however long it takes. So for me, it took me 5 years. And then after you finish that PhD, you go back to the last 2 years of medical school, which is like the clinical part. So during my PhD, I ended up doing research on the Rhesus monkey, looking at adult neurogenesis, which was something that I I had read some papers in like a Scientific American or something like that. And I thought it was like the coolest things. And when I was starting my PhD, I remember, finding Dr. Rosine, who eventually agreed to take me into his lab and being like, hey, I just, read about this cool thing and you've got, a primate lab and I'd really like to study this. And we kind of came up with my PhD project for which I had an NIH F31 grant. So then as I was finishing up, my PhD and going back to my clinical years, I really was still like debating what I was going to do with like the medical part of my degree, because I had gone into this knowing that I wanted to do research. So, part of me couldn't decide, do I just want to be a neuroscientist or, do I want to use my medical degree? And if I do that, because I know I wanted to focus on something neuro related, do I want to do neurology or did I want to do neurosurgery? And as I did my clinical years, I found that I loved being in the operating room. So it was not something that I, initially from the beginning thought that I was going to be a neurosurgeon, but I really enjoyed it. And, I remember my PhD mentor being really upset with me because he's like, you are never going to do research again. You're going to be a surgeon. Like you're just going to make a ton of money as a surgeon and you are never going to do any research ever again. So I went into neurosurgery residency. And because I was determined that I wasn't going to give up on the research because that was, kind of what started my career trajectory in the first place. I made sure that I had opportunity to do research even while I was doing my neurosurgery training. So I ended up doing my residency at Ohio State. And the way the program was structured is that there was 2 years in the middle of the residency, which is a 7-year residency. But there was 2 years in the middle where you could do like a fellowship or you could do research. So I used that time to do research and I did like lab research and actually worked in a lab, worked on a project that had some stuff that was related to what I had done in my PhD. So I was still looking at neurogenesis, but picking up some new skills because I found that I was really interested in brain trauma and traumatic brain injury. So learning sort of the animal models of traumatic brain injury and being able to get a paper out of that helped show that I wasn't sort of dead to the research world for all those 7 years that I was in residency. So then as I finished up my residency, I ended up doing a fellowship in neurotrauma. In the medical world, if you want to go into academics, you essentially have to have not only all of your residency training, but you have to have sort of a subspecialty. So as opposed to just sort of a standard postdoc, I needed to have clinical subspecialty training in addition to additional research training. So I did a neurotrauma fellowship at UCSF. This allowed me to actually have some exposure to clinical research, which I hadn't been exposed to that much before. And there was a big focus on traumatic brain injury as it was one of the big sites for the clinical research that's done in traumatic brain injury. And it also allowed me to have a mentor that was also MD PhD, and also in terms of how things work in academics and in neurosurgery, was able to help me in terms of getting an academic faculty position.
You have 1 minute left, Dr. Ngwenya.
Okay. So I ended up taking a position here at University of Cincinnati as the director of the Neuro Trauma Center, and I've been here, I believe this is my 5th year now. So I kind of put it all together by having everything sort of focused on traumatic brain injury research. So with my role as the director of the Neuro Trauma Center, I'm involved in clinical research, but then I also do basic science research that's all focused on traumatic brain injury. So my main research is actually looking at brain tsunamis, also called spreading depolarizations. And I study these both in patients. So we have patients where sometimes we take them to the OR because they've had a traumatic brain injury. And when we're in surgery, we can put these little strips on their brain, and that allows us to study these spreading depolarizations. And because we're a little bit limited as to how much we can learn just from patients, I also study the same phenomena in my laboratory. So I have a rat model of traumatic brain injury, and I induce these spreading depolarizations in my rat model. So I'm studying these in my lab as well. And then I'm also involved in sort of clinical research and clinical trials and things as well. So a little bit of a different approach than what others have presented, but you know, in the end, I've somehow brought all of it together and try not to go crazy. So I will stop there.
All right, thank you, Dr. Ngwenya.